The suburban house in Boston was immersed in the pre-winter chill. The light from the street lamps, as if frozen in a thin mist, flickered through the fogged windows. Life in this house was like the clock on the kitchen wall, a steady rhythm, predictable and calm. Morning breakfasts with Mom, when Sarah, strict and always composed, would serve fresh buttered toast. Recently, we had a new tenant, Nate, my father's younger brother. His divorce had been the family news of the week, though he didn't say much about it. He simply moved into our house, bringing with him boxes of books, a few old guitars, and a strange, somewhat heavy energy that I couldn't explain. Nate hardly spoke to me. His interactions were mostly limited to evening talks with Dad in the living room or loud music blaring from the garage, which he played while fixing something old and long abandoned. I couldn't say I liked him. His seriousness was a bit intimidating, and his silence seemed mysterious, but there was something about his presence that sparked a strange curiosity. Maybe it was because, in contrast to his somber appearance, my life seemed even more dull. That evening, sitting in the kitchen, I listened to Mom muttering something about work as she monotonously placed dishes into the dishwasher. It was late evening. I returned home from work, tired and irritable, as if the day had drained all my energy. As I approached the house, I heard the sound of guitar chords quietly escaping from the garage. The sound was soft, somewhat sad, but it resonated. I had never heard Nate play before. Nate was sitting on an old chair, leaning against a worn guitar case. His long fingers glided over the strings, drawing out a sound that carried both sadness and warmth at the same time. He looked up, noticing me, and gave a slight nod. "I didn't know you played," I said, trying to hide my embarrassment. He shrugged. "I used to play when I was younger. Now, it's rare, probably just to remind myself how it's done." "Is it your own stuff?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Number. It's old, from the 90s. I used to love playing this when I was younger. Back then I dreamed of a band, of touring." He smirked, but there was more bitterness in that smirk than joy. "Dreams that are left somewhere back there." "Why did you quit?" I asked, not sure if it was appropriate. "Sometimes dreams just die, and sometimes you bury them yourself, just to survive." His voice was quiet but firm. That conversation struck a chord with me. There was a depth to Nate that made you want to listen. I could feel that there was much more hidden in him than he was willing to show. After that, I began visiting the garage more often. Sometimes we'd talk about trivial things, music, books, movies. Other times, we just sat in silence while he played or fixed something at his workbench. It was easy with Nate. He didn't expect anything from me, didn't ask questions that made me feel uncomfortable. It was such a rarity that I began to treasure those moments. Deep down, I understood. My dull, routine life was starting to crack just a little, and that didn't scare me at all. Saturday morning began with Alex calling and suggesting we meet at our favorite coffee shop. This place had always been like a familiar hideaway for us, where we'd discuss work, weekend plans, or simply enjoy the warmth of a cinnamon latte. But this time, something felt off. I sensed it even before I stepped through the door. Alex was already sitting at the table by the window, neatly placing his phone next to his cup. His perfectly pressed shirt and flawless hairstyle had always seemed endearing to me, but now there was something too polished about them. He stood up to greet me, and I noticed his smile looked like a well-rehearsed gesture. Maybe I hadn't noticed it before. "How's the week been?" he asked as I sat down across from him. "Fine, as usual," I replied, pulling the menu toward me, though I knew I would order the same thing I always did. Alex began talking about work, a new project, how his boss praised him for his attention to detail. I watched him, nodded at the right moments, even smiled, but somewhere deep inside, I felt a strange emptiness. This was someone I'd known for several years, yet his words now sounded like white noise. When the waitress brought our order, I caught myself realizing, throughout the entire time Alex was talking, I didn't feel even a hint of joy, just the obligatory politeness. After the meeting, I decided to take a walk. Leaving the coffee shop, I headed to the park. The air was cold and fresh, and the sidewalks were covered with a thin layer of fallen leaves. I walked slowly, not in any hurry, reflecting on what was happening in my life. How had I ended up in this state, where even what should bring joy felt meaningless? On one of the alleys, I noticed an elderly couple. They were walking slowly, holding hands. There was no rush, no fuss in their movements, only a calm confidence in each other. Their view of the world was so quiet yet genuine that I wanted to stop and ask, how? How did they get to this point? Is this what I want in my life? Or am I just drifting, afraid to ask myself those questions? When I got home, I saw Nate in the backyard. He was crouched next to some old toolbox, fixing something. I could have just walked past him, as I had done hundreds of times before, but something stopped me. Need help? I asked, walking closer. He looked up, studied me as if assessing whether I was serious, and nodded. We fumbled with the tools, talked about trivial things, how hard it was to find the right screw, how quickly it gets dark in the fall. It was an ordinary evening, but I felt like it meant more to me than it appeared. Dinner that evening took place in tense silence. Mom was talking about the neighbors, and Dad lazily nodded, not taking his eyes off his plate. Nate sat across from me, as reserved as ever, but he seemed lost in his thoughts. I wasn't particularly chatty either. After that day in the park and the evening with Nate, I had too many questions for myself. At one point, Mom looked up and gave me the kind of smile she usually used when she wanted to say something, but didn't know how to start. "You and Nate seem to get along well," she remarked casually, gently wiping the utensils with a napkin. Her voice was light, but there was a tone that made me uneasy. I looked up. Dad continued eating as if he hadn't heard a thing, but Nate froze for a second before going back to pretending he was fully absorbed in his meal. "We're just talking," I answered, trying to sound calm. Mom nodded, but her gaze told me she wasn't satisfied with my answer. No one spoke another word during dinner. Later, while I was washing the dishes, Sarah came over to me. She always did this in such a quiet, subtle way, as if she were trying to catch me off guard. I felt her presence before she even spoke. "Is there something you want to tell me?" she asked, placing her hands on the countertop next to me. "No," I replied shortly, without turning around. "Are you sure?" Her voice was surprisingly soft, but there was a steely edge to it. "Mom, I don't understand what you mean," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying me. "You spend a lot of time with Nate. Is it just friendship, or is it something more?" "Of course, just friendship. Why are you even asking?" I snapped. "You've changed," she said softly. "You're different since he's been here." Her words hit me hard. I shrugged them off, muttering something about how she was just making things up, and left the kitchen. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were tangled. Could it really look like that? Or was Mom just trying to control everything as usual? The next few days, Nate clearly tried to avoid me. He left his room less often, and when I tried to start a conversation, he responded briefly and curtly. That evening was typically autumnal, with a cool breeze and the smell of charcoal wafting across the yard. We had a family barbecue, a tradition Mom followed with almost religious strictness. Dad was grilling the meat, Sarah was carefully setting the table, and I sat aside, watching all of this with a feeling that was hard to call joy. Nate was there too, but he kept his distance, as if deliberately avoiding my gaze. You've been avoiding me these last few days, I said directly. He looked at me and frowned slightly. No, I haven't been avoiding you. I just thought it would be better this way, he replied calmly. Better for whom? I couldn't help but ask. For everyone, he said at last. For you, for me, for your mom. I wanted to argue, but at that moment, Mom called us from the porch. Nate stood up, gave a short nod, and went over to the others, leaving me with a heap of thoughts. Are you leaving? I asked, stepping inside. Nate flinched in surprise but didn't turn around. Yes, he answered after a brief pause. I think it's time. Why? What happened? My words came out almost desperately. Do you really want to know? He asked. Because if I tell you, it won't change anything. I want to understand, I said, feeling my fingers tighten. Nate sighed and sat on the edge of the bed. This house, your family, everything here is so perfect and polished that any deviation feels like a threat. I don't want to be that threat. I don't want to break your world. You're not breaking anything, I interrupted. I'll figure out what's wrong with my world on my own. He shook his head, smiling slightly. You're a good person, and I don't want you to have problems because of me. We sat in silence until we heard footsteps outside. Nate quickly stood up and continued packing his things. The next morning, he was gone. In the kitchen, I found a note written on a torn piece of paper. Thanks for everything. Take care of yourself. These words were simple, but their weight pressed down on me all day.